Imagine an army that never files paperwork, no dog tags in a ledger, no promotions, no medals, just men who move through maps like ink stains. There one moment, gone the next. In Vietnam, they had a dozen names for them. Recon elements, special liaison, allied assets. But the men who met them had a simpler word, ghosts. And if you think you know the war, if you think Vietnam was helicopters and napalm and radio chatter and body counts, then you only know the version that could be shown in briefings. The real war happened under the canopy, where sound was a sin and survival was a private agreement between you and the jungle. This story is about one American colonel who believed the world ran on procedures, and 5 Australians who treated procedures like a good way to get killed. It is about pride being peeled off like wet skin. It is about the moment a man realizes the machine he worships can't save him. And it is about a terrifying truth those 5 men carried, something they didn't even tell their allies, because if you say it out loud, the whole doctrine collapses. So listen closely, because this isn't a story about victory, it's a story about what victory costs when nobody is allowed to see it. Colonel Arthur Blackwood arrived in Southeast Asia the way some men arrive in church, upright, polished, convinced of order. He was West Point built, sharp angles, squared shoulders, the kind of officer whose uniform looked pressed even after a storm. He had a chest full of brass and a mind full of doctrine. He spoke in clean sentences. He trusted maps. He believed in schedules the way superstitious people believe in charms. To him, war was a system. You applied pressure here, you reinforced there, you cut supply lines, you rotated units, you measured results. He believed chaos was just a problem you hadn't charted properly yet. From a helicopter, Vietnam looked like it agreed with him. The jungle became a textured green carpet. Rivers were lines, villages were dots. You could draw arrows, you could circle zones, you could pretend the earth itself understood the logic of an operations order. Blackwood wasn't naive. He'd watched men bleed in other countries and other forests. He'd seen the look in a soldier's eyes right before the body realizes it's already dead. But he still clung to the comforting belief that if you did things correctly, if you followed the manual, then your odds would rise like numbers on a chart. And for 20 years, that belief had carried him, until Puoc Tuy. Rumors had drifted up to his desk like smoke. Allied reconnaissance, Australians in the province, men who operated without the American appetite for noise, men who didn't call for support the way everyone else did, men who supposedly cut their equipment down, taped their buckles, walked through enemy territory as if the jungle belonged to them. Blackwood dismissed most of it as myth. He expected to find brave soldiers, yes, but still soldiers. He imagined a briefing room, a roster, a radio net, a tidy explanation for how they worked. He requested a short observational attachment, 4 days, in, out, notes taken, report filed. He wanted data. He got a conversion. The Australian base wasn't what he expected. There was no polished welcome, no handshakes from men eager to impress an American colonel. There was just heat and insects and a bored transport officer who glanced at Blackwood's rank like it was a rumor. "You're with them," the officer said, and pointed toward the tree line as if pointing to a weather front. Blackwood stepped off the hard world and into the soft one. At the edge of the jungle, 5 men waited in a line that wasn't a line at all, more like 5 mistakes the forest had forgotten to erase. They were filthy, quiet. Their uniforms weren't uniforms anymore. They were stained cloth clinging to muscle and mud. No rank insignia, no unit patches, no shiny buckles, no helmets. Their faces were smudged and shadowed in a way that made it hard to decide where the man ended and the foliage began. One of them held a rifle that made Blackwood's stomach tighten. It was an L1A1, common enough, but the barrel had been brutally shortened, sawed down until it looked like an injury. Another carried an old Owen gun like something dragged out of a museum. Their gear was wrapped in tape and fabric, anything to kill the small noises that give you away when everything else is quiet. Blackwood waited for a salute that never came. He waited for introductions that never arrived. He waited most of all for the radio operator. There was no radio operator. He scanned for an antenna, a pack, a handset, any evidence of a lifeline. Nothing. Finally, he cleared his throat and asked too sharply, "Where's your communications link?" The tallest one, lean, sunburnt, eyes like chipped glass, didn't answer with words. He tapped his forehead once, as if the question itself had been funny. Then he turned and started walking. That was the briefing. Blackwood stood there for a moment with his clipboard and his folder of crisp orders and felt, for the first time in years, like he might be wearing a costume in the wrong play. He followed. The jungle punished him immediately, not with bullets, not with traps, with humiliation. The heat wrapped around him like wet canvas. 10 minutes in, his pressed uniform clung to his skin as if trying to drag him back into the mud. Sweat ran into his eyes and stung like salt. His pack, standard issue, regulation weight, packed with items the manual insisted were necessary, bit into his shoulders with the cruelty of a rulebook. The Australians ahead of him moved like the jungle had created them to fit between leaves. Blackwood moved like a man wearing furniture. His canteen slapped and sloshed. His buckles clicked. His map case scraped against branches. Every time he stepped, something snapped. Twigs, vines, dry leaves. Each sound felt like a flare fired straight into the sky. He tried to correct it, held his gear tighter, adjusted straps, moved more carefully, but the harder he tried, the more obvious he became. It was like trying trying to whisper while dragging chains. At one point he stumbled on a slick route and went down hard, knee first into the mud. The impact made a dull thud that seemed to echo through the trees like a drum. The Australians stopped instantly, not with shouts, not with gestures. They just froze. The forest froze with them. Even the insects seemed to pause. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward Blackwood, not angry, not concerned, not amused, disappointed. It was the coldest judgment he'd ever felt, because it wasn't personal. It was professional. It was the look you give an exposed wire or a cracked bridge. Something dangerous because it fails quietly until it kills someone. They didn't help him up. They waited for him to become less of a problem. Blackwood rose, cheeks burning hotter than the air. His rank felt imaginary. His medals felt like extra weight. In the jungle, dignity is loud. Loud gets you killed. By midday, his boots, perfect on parade grounds, became instruments of torture. The leather held water like a curse. Blisters formed, burst, and turned every step into a small private scream. He looked ahead and saw something that made him almost angry. Sergeant Jack Harper. "Dingo," he heard one of the others murmur once, walked barefoot for stretches, placing each foot as if the ground could speak back. When he slipped on his modified boots, Blackwood saw holes cut into them for drainage, a sacrilege against every supply regulation. It looked primitive. It also worked. Blackwood tried to pull out his compass to check bearings, to reassert some geometry over the green chaos. But the map in his hands turned into a joke, lines and grids that meant nothing under a ceiling of leaves. The Australians never looked at it. They looked at shadows, wind, the angle of vines, the way ants moved, the sudden absence of birds. They were reading the world in a language Blackwood didn't know existed, and the worst part was this: they weren't teaching him, they were simply surviving. If he learned, it would be because he deserved to. Night fell like a trap closing. The canopy turned the sky into a sealed black lid. The jungle didn't become quiet, it became listening. Every sound traveled differently, as if the darkness carried it. Blackwood lay in the dirt under a damp poncho liner, heart beating too loud, mind too awake. Fatigue made shadows breed. A leaf twitch became a footstep. A distant crack became a weapon being checked. He kept his hand near his pistol like a man clutching a rosary. He told himself he was being vigilant. What he was, really, was afraid. Something moved to his left. A shape detached itself from a tree trunk and slid downward. Slow, deliberate, unnatural. Blackwood's blood turned cold. Enemy. His brain didn't wait for proof. It went straight to survival. He began to draw his pistol, the metal whispering against leather. In the silent jungle, that whisper sounded like thunder. His finger found the trigger. He raised the muzzle toward the shape, and then a hand crushed his wrist from behind. Blackwood almost shouted. The grip wasn't just strong, it was absolute, like iron clamping bone. Sergeant Harper didn't speak. He didn't even breathe loudly. He simply forced the pistol down into the dirt and held it there, letting Blackwood feel, in his tendons and his panic, how close he'd been to killing all of them. The shadow moved again. Not a soldier. A python, thick as a man's thigh, sliding down the tree, tasting the air with a forked tongue, indifferent to human war. Blackwood's stomach turned with nausea. One shot, one stupid, frightened shot, and every enemy unit in kilometers would have converged on them like ants on sugar. Harper held his wrist a few seconds longer, like a lesson you couldn't forget. Then he let go and vanished back into the black. No words. None were needed. In that moment, Blackwood understood the first law of this patrol. Your fear is louder than the enemy. By the third day, something in Colonel Blackwood began to crack. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in quiet splinters. He stopped trying to lead. He stopped trying to argue. He moved when they moved. He stopped when they stopped. He learned to tape his gear with strips of cloth they tossed him without comment. He learned to breathe through his nose. He learned to place his feet. And still, he felt like a bull in a glass shop. It happened with the birds. One moment the jungle buzzed and chirped and hummed like a living machine. The next moment it went dead. Not peaceful dead, vacant. The Australians froze. Blackwood strained his ears until his head hurt. At first he heard nothing. Then, a smell. Faint. Sour. Wrong. Cigarette smoke. Someone nearby, upwind, careless enough to light a stick of fire in the one place where fire doesn't belong. Blackwood's training screamed. Contact. Call it in. Fix them. Coordinate. Dominate. Harper did none of that. He didn't reach for a radio, because there wasn't one. He simply angled the patrol into a slow, wide arc toward higher ground, as if skirting around a puddle. No rush. No noise. They moved like wolves that had already decided the fight wasn't worth the risk. Through ferns and gaps, Blackwood saw them. 6 or 7 North Vietnamese soldiers clustered near a trail, talking softly, smoking, relaxed. An American patrol would have made it an event. A radio call, a strike request, a beautiful explosion followed by a report. The Australians watched. One man climbed a tree without sound and disappeared into leaves. Another slid behind a root mass and became part of it. Blackwood blinked and realized he couldn't account for them anymore. Harper glanced at him once, only once, and held up 3 fingers, then tapped his wrist. 3 minutes. Wait. Blackwood's pulse hammered. He expected an ambush, but the 3 minutes passed and the enemy finished smoking and moved on. And the Australians, let them. They didn't engage. They didn't collect bodies. They didn't announce anything. They simply flowed around the unit and continued deeper, leaving the enemy unaware that they had ever been observed at all. Blackwood felt an unexpected shiver. This wasn't cowardice. This was a different kind of control. One that didn't need witnesses. A war with no applause. The ravine smelled like stagnant water and rust. The light was wrong there, filtered into a permanent twilight by layered canopy. The air felt thicker, the insects quieter. The lead scout stopped. Not crouched. watched, not signaled, just stopped, staring ahead as if he had seen a ghost that belonged to him. Blackwood stepped forward, annoyed at first, then the smell hit him. Not jungle, not rot, synthetic fabric, old leather, a sweet, terrible note that every veteran recognizes the way a dog recognizes lightning. Death. They entered a clearing that the jungle had tried to bury. Scattered remains, 6 American long-range reconnaissance troops, long dead, reclaimed by vines and ferns, helmets half swallowed by mud, webbing twisted like roots, rib cages exposed like broken umbrellas. They had formed a textbook perimeter. They had done everything right. In the center lay the radio operator, skeletal hands still curled around a PRC handset, the green box strapped to his spine. The antenna rose toward the canopy like a metal finger begging the sky for mercy. Blackwood stared at it, throat dry. The radio, the sacred lifeline, the thing he'd spent a career defending as necessity. Here it looked like a curse. He imagined the sequence, a desperate call, a whispered grid, an urgent request for extraction. The enemy listening, tracking, closing. The radio's weight keeping them slow, the antenna advertising their position. Blackwood's boots crunched on spent brass. He saw a map case sealed in plastic, lines drawn neatly, a plan approved by men who sat under fluorescent lights. Now it was just rot. The Australians didn't touch the bodies. They didn't kneel. They didn't make speeches. They looked at the scene like reading a warning sign. Harper's eyes flicked to the handset, then to Blackwood. No smugness, just a statement without words. This is what your system buys you. Blackwood felt something inside him go cold. For years he'd believed technology multiplied survival. Here was proof that in certain places, technology simply multiplied your visibility, and visibility gets paid for in blood. They left the clearing without ceremony, letting the jungle erase the evidence. Blackwood followed, and for the first time he understood something that made his skin crawl. Those 5 men were not braver than the Americans who died there. They were simply less dependent. They had removed every habit that required permission to survive. The first shots happened so fast, Blackwood wasn't sure they'd happened at all. There was no build-up, no whispered warning, no dramatic point, just a tiny shift in posture, a head tilt, a pause as if the forest had blinked. Then the Australians dispersed, 1 second present, the next gone, dissolved into vines and shadow. Blackwood crouched behind a fern, eyes wide, unable to see what had triggered them. The jungle held its breath. Then 3 cracks, clean, spaced, final. Not automatic fire, not panic, not volume, decisions. 3 shots that sounded less like gunfire and more like punctuation. When silence returned, it returned heavy. The Australians reappeared as if rising from the ground itself, breathing steady, faces calm, no celebration. Harper knelt by a body, an NVA pointman who had drifted too close, too curious. Harper checked the weapon, then covered the body with broad leaves, not out of respect, but out of habit. Disappear the evidence. Blackwood stepped forward, mind scrambling for protocol. Shouldn't we report? Harper shook his head without looking up. No need, no radio log, no coordinates, no request for permission, no paperwork trail. The enemy unit wouldn't find their man for hours, and by then it wouldn't matter. The patrol had removed a threat that could have compromised someone else's mission days later. Blackwood swallowed. He'd spent his life measuring war with numbers, rounds fired, targets hit, zones secured. This war couldn't be measured. It didn't leave receipts. It didn't even leave sound. It simply subtracted danger from the world and moved on. Blackwood realized with a strange unease that if he raised his radio now, if he called headquarters to tell them what he'd witnessed, he couldn't. There was nothing to describe in the language the machine understood. No fire support, no extraction, no engagement duration. Just 3 dead men and a team that had already vanished from the moment. The 4th day was the worst because it demanded the one skill Blackwood had never truly practiced. Not tactics, not leadership, not courage, stillness. They were hours from what Blackwood assumed was an extraction zone. The jungle felt slightly different, the air turning, the light changing. He allowed himself the smallest taste of relief. Then the ground began to tremble. Not earthquake tremble. Footsteps, a lot of them. Harper went rigid. His hand lifted once, down, and then Blackwood heard it. The dull rhythm of hundreds of boots, the clatter of gear, the low murmur of a moving body of men. A North Vietnamese battalion was cutting across their path. Big, fast, close. There was no time to circle wide, no time to retreat without being seen. The terrain offered one ugly hiding place, a shallow depression filled with black water, rotting leaves, and the stench of old things. Harper dropped into it without hesitation. The others followed like they'd rehearsed it their whole lives. Blackwood hesitated for half a heartbeat, then dove. Mud swallowed his uniform. Filth filled his mouth. The smell made him gag, and he had to clamp his jaw shut to keep from coughing. He pressed his cheek into the earth until roots dug into his skin, and then they waited. The first enemy soldier passed so close Blackwood could see the frayed hem of his trousers, the mud on his sandals, the sweat on his calf. Another followed, then another, then another. It became a river of men flowing past their grave. Blackwood's heart hammered like a drum in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to run, to do something. He felt a mosquito land on his nose and bite. He felt sweat crawl into his eye and burn. He didn't blink. Time stretched into something cruel. At one point, a soldier stopped, right in front of them. Blackwood's lungs locked. He stared at the weeds above his face, at a thin stem trembling in the air. He was certain the soldier could hear his heartbeat, certain the soldier could smell his fear. The man adjusted his rifle strap, spat into the mud. The spit landed inches from Blackwood's fingers. Then the soldier moved on. When the battalion finally passed and the last footstep faded, Harper didn't move. None of them did. They stayed in the muck long after safety returned, letting the jungle accept them again, letting the air settle, letting the world forget. When Harper finally rose, he did it slowly, like a creature emerging from a swamp in a dream. Blackwood followed, dripping filth, shaking with adrenaline. He didn't wipe his face. He didn't check his uniform. He simply breathed, deep, ragged, and tasted air like it was the sweetest luxury he'd ever been given. He had survived not by defeating the enemy, but by becoming irrelevant to them. Later, as the jungle began to thin and the light sharpened, Blackwood finally asked the question that had been trapped in his chest for 4 days. What's the extraction plan? It was so normal a question, it should have been harmless. Every Western military operation lived and died by exit strategy, coordinates, LZs, rally points, contingencies, a plan for when the plan fails. Harper didn't stop walking. He didn't even turn his head. "We don't extract," he said, flat as stone. Blackwood blinked. "What?" Harper kept moving. "We walk." 2 syllables, a doctrine, a verdict. Blackwood stopped dead, mud drying on his skin, and felt the last pillar of his worldview sway. "We walk." No helicopter thunder, no rescue net, no quick reaction force waiting like a promise, no medical evacuation hovering in the future, because every one of those things makes noise, and noise is a flare. Blackwood stared at the 5 men ahead, lean, taped, quiet, eyes constantly scanning, packs stripped to essentials. He saw what he hadn't been able to see at the start. They weren't poorly equipped. They were intentionally unburdened. They had amputated every dependence. They had removed the idea of rescue from their minds, and that was the terrifying truth they never said out loud, not even to allies. A system that expects to rescue you teaches you, in subtle ways, to fail. It teaches you to tolerate risk because someone else will catch you. It teaches you to be loud, to be heavy, to call for help. But the jungle does not care about your help. So the SAS didn't train to be saved. They trained to never require saving. Blackwood felt something like shame, sharp, unfamiliar. His career had been devoted to building safety nets, layered support, constant communication, procedures for every emergency. And here were 5 men who treated the safety net like a snare. He understood now why their rifles looked butchered, why they taped their buckles, why they refused radios. They weren't just soldiers. They were exit plans wrapped in skin. The return to civilization felt unreal. At the edge of the Australian perimeter, a truck waited to take Blackwood back to the American headquarters. Back to coffee, radios, maps pinned to walls, the comforting illusion that war could be organized like an office. Harper and his team didn't climb in. They didn't shake hands. They didn't say goodbye. They simply stepped into the scrub and vanished, already belonging to the next mission. Blackwood sat alone in the truck bed, boots torn, sidearm rusted with sweat, notebook pages warped and smeared. He looked toward the tree line one last time. There was nothing there. If he hadn't been covered in mud, he might have convinced himself the whole patrol had been a fever dream. Back at headquarters, the noise hit him like an insult. Radios squawking, officers shouting, helicopters thumping in the distance, paper shuffling, pencil scratching. It was the sound of a machine reassuring itself. Blackwood walked past the operations map, pins, arrows, colored zones, and felt an unexpected bitterness. The clean lines looked childish. Puoc Tuy Province sat on the wall like a tidy label. Low activity, limited contact. Blackwood almost laughed. What he had seen wasn't low activity. It was a different war entirely. A war that left no icon on a map. A war that couldn't be measured by the forms on his desk. That night he sat down with an after-action report template and realized he couldn't fill it out. He hadn't fired a shot. He hadn't called in support. He hadn't logged coordinates. He hadn't counted bodies. The machine wanted numbers. All he had were truths. So under remarks, he wrote a paragraph no one would know what to do with. He wrote that he had watched 5 men do more in 4 days than some battalions could accomplish in a month. He wrote that their doctrine wasn't about conquering terrain. It was about erasing themselves from it. He wrote that the loudest army in the world could still be blind in the jungle. Then he stopped. He looked down at his boots, still stained with the deep bush mud that didn't wash out. He looked at his pistol on the desk. He hadn't drawn it once on that patrol. And he understood something that would haunt him more than any firefight. His weapon was for emergencies. The SAS lived in a way that made emergencies rare. Before turning off the light, Colonel Blackwood spoke to the empty room, not as an officer, but as a man admitting defeat to a truth he could never put into doctrine. "We train to win with firepower," he whispered. "They win by never being seen." And somewhere out in the jungle, 5 ghosts kept walking, barefoot through hell, without radios, without ranks, without permission, leaving behind a kind of victory that history could never prove.